Welcome to Diagnosing Health Care, a podcast featuring thought-provoking conversations about the latest legal, policy, and regulatory issues in healthcare. While these issues may seem like hurdles, we'll also look at the business opportunities and solutions that exist. Diagnosing Healthcare is brought to you by the healthcare lawyers at Epstein Becker Green, a leading law firm that has more than 40 years' experience serving clients in the healthcare industry nationwide.
Today on Diagnosing Healthcare, we'll discuss what sets biotechnology companies apart from the pharmaceutical industry, look at the unique regulatory challenges they face, and how they meet those challenges through strategic partnerships and otherwise. Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Rachel Weisblatt. I'm an attorney at Epstein Becker Green's Healthcare and Life Sciences practice based out of our Boston office. The biotechnology industry has experienced explosive growth over the last several years. While the COVID-19 pandemic led to an economic downturn for a number of industries, the biotech industry has shown its resiliency, meeting the pandemic's challenges and continuing to grow and mature. There's estimated to be about 6,000 biotech startups in the United States, and in 2020, biotech companies raised $34.3 billion globally from initial public offerings, an increase of 186% on the previous year, with the majority of that funding coming to U.S. companies. Unlike their pharmaceutical company counterparts, biotech companies are typically small, entrepreneurial, and efficient at bringing new innovations to market. While they lack the size and resources of big pharma, many large pharmaceutical companies rely on strategic partnerships with smaller biotech companies to drive innovation. Biotech companies are now responsible for most of the innovative new drugs being approved by the FDA and brought to market each year. On today's show, we're going to hear from two former biotechnology CEOs who will reflect on the regulatory challenges that they faced and explore how current events are shaping the future of the biotechnology industry. If you like what you hear today, please subscribe to our show. Diagnosing Healthcare is available wherever you get your podcasts. Today, we welcome to the show Donald Drakeman, Lisa Drakeman, and Rob Wanerman. Donald was the founding CEO of a U.S. biotech company that pioneered development of the checkpoint inhibitor cancer treatments, recognized in the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 2018. He's a fellow in technology management at the Cambridge Judge Business School and a venture partner at Advent Life Sciences. Lisa was the founding CEO of one of Europe's most successful biotechnology companies. She's a member of the board of the Medical University of South Carolina Foundation for Research Development. She's received numerous industry honors and has been a faculty member at Princeton University. She regularly lectures on entrepreneurship at universities in both the United States and Europe. Donald and Lisa, along with a Cambridge University professor, have recently authored a book, From Breakthrough to Blockbuster: The Business of Biotechnology, published by Oxford University Press. It was just named a top business title by the Financial Times. Welcome, Don and Lisa. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Rachel. Thanks for having us today.
Thanks, Rachel. We're looking forward to it.
Rob Wanerman also joins the show today. Rob is a member of the firm in our healthcare and life sciences practice. Rob's clients include biotech companies and healthcare startups that he advises on regulatory, reimbursement, and compliance issues, including working with manufacturers and innovators on coverage, coding, and reimbursement for new technologies and related procedures. Welcome and thanks for being here, Rob.
Thanks, Rachel.
Let's get started. Don and Lisa, in your book, you make the case that biotech companies are different from pharmaceutical or other therapeutic companies. What do you think are the most important factors that distinguish biotechnology companies?
To begin with, Rachel, one of the key distinctions is size. Biotech companies and pharmaceutical companies use the same technologies, try to treat the same diseases, but biotech companies are much smaller, very focused on the technologies they're working with. Don, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, if you think about it, both groups, the pharmaceutical industry and the biotech industry, are using the same technologies to try to come up with new treatments for the same diseases. The major difference is that the pharmaceutical companies have been at it for 100 years. They have massively more resources. They have scope and scale that no biotech company can match. And at the end of the day, it turns out that the large group of little companies has out-innovated the smaller group of very large companies in terms of coming up with the highest priority new medicines approved by the FDA over the last 20 years.
Thank you. Although the biotech and pharmaceutical industries are clearly unique, strategic alliances between companies within these industries have been critical in developing new products. What is the range of potential partners for an innovator, and how are these alliances formed?
Strategic partnerships can run the gamut from something as small as a research agreement, where the parties might decide to do something together in a lab, all the way to a full-blown development partnership, which includes marketing and sales of a product that's approved. One of the key reasons that biotech companies enter those alliances is because they need the resources of the pharma company, primarily money. This is an incredibly difficult industry to succeed in. There are lots of barriers to entry, such as regulatory hurdles and long timelines to create a new product. So a lot of money and a lot of people need to work together to make these products work. And the pharma companies can bring many of those resources to the table, where the biotech companies are bringing really exciting innovations and potential new products that the pharma companies need for their pipelines. Don, why don't you add to that?
I think that's absolutely right. But in the last number of years, we've seen a bit of an evolution thanks to the enormous amounts of money that have been raised by biotech companies that you pointed to, Rachel, in your introduction. As a result, biotech companies are able to hang on to many more products than they used to be able to, take them all the way to market. And that provides a new opportunity for biotech companies to grow into their own established pharmaceutical companies and not just be the R side of pharma R&D.
Building on that, the 2020 collaboration between Pfizer and BioNTech to develop a vaccine for COVID-19 comes to mind as one of the most recent, both meaningful and lucrative strategic collaborations. Pfizer's involvement aside, why do you think the main COVID vaccines being used in the US were developed by two small companies and not some of the biggest vaccine developers?
You know, there's a great story in our book that points to the attitude of one of the large pharma companies to the mRNA technology that's behind the new vaccines. And this very large vaccine company believed that the technology simply wasn't ready. That's maybe one of the key differences between the pharma industry and the biotech industry. Biotech companies focus on new technologies that may be groundbreaking. They're willing to take a chance. They believe in what they're doing. They think the science justifies what they're doing. And in the case of the BioNTech vaccine, that was absolutely true. But it's much harder if you're in a pharmaceutical company to overcome all the internal barriers that keep people from putting resources into something new.
I think that's exactly right. And Rachel and Lisa, you've both kind of pointed to the biggest difference between biotech and pharma, which is how they decide about what to do. Little biotech companies, there are 6,000 of them, as you mentioned, and there are probably just as many investors at the private level, from angels to venture capitalists, public investors in the IPO and follow-on markets. And that allows all of these different biotech companies to try things that would never pass muster when it got to a pharmaceutical executive committee as to what's a good, reliable way of developing a new drug. As a result, the genuinely innovative things tend to be stopped at big pharma, while at biotech, they keep going. They don't all work, but when they do, we get something as path-breaking as the mRNA vaccines for COVID or the Nobel Prize winning products you mentioned earlier for cancer.
Of course, cross-industry partnerships are not the only meaningful collaborations in the biotech industry. Can you address the role of collaborations between academia and the private sector, and particularly the role of the BiDol Act, which allows universities and nonprofit research institutions to commercialize inventions developed using federal grant funds?
BiDol is one of the modern marvels of the scientific world. The academic research universities had been before that doing lots of great research and have continued to do research. But before BiDol, all of that research funded by the government was owned by the government. And it was a bit like the Ark of the Covenant in the Raiders of the Lost Ark movie, where Indiana Jones goes through all sorts of harrowing adventures to find it and bring it back. And then it just gets put in the back of a great big government warehouse. Once those technologies had been essentially ceded to the universities, and the universities were given an incentive to out-license them, and they would share in some of the benefits in the future, that started the basically new set of rules by which academic research that needed more support could find venture capitalists looking for exciting new things to invest in. The university was able to make that happen in a way that had not happened before. There should be a Nobel Prize coming along for the BiDol Act at some point.
Moving on to your personal experience, biotech and drug development is one of the most heavily regulated industries in every facet. You have both run two biotech companies. What were the largest U.S. regulatory challenges that you faced, and how are those challenges resolved?
That's not an easy question to answer. We operate in an environment where we have to be mindful of the regulatory requirements all the time, but that's in conjunction with the needs of the patients who we are trying to serve, as well as the investors who expect results. So in some ways, the biggest challenge is negotiating a pathway between all those, let's call them interested parties to what we're doing. I mean, in other ways, the FDA has worked pretty hard to be a good partner to the industry with not only special approval procedures, but also with the way that they'll interact. They'll offer meetings, they'll offer guidance.
Yeah, absolutely right. One of the differences we didn't highlight earlier between pharma and biotech is that a lot of little biotech companies are trying to make it up as they go along. And you can't make up the FDA regulations. You have to fit within the rules that the FDA lays down. And so it's very important to get the right kind of guidance as you're developing. The flip side is that a lot of the pharma companies are very experienced in dealing with the agencies, but they tend to be very conservative and unwilling to try to kind of push a little for new ideas to be looked at in new ways. A very useful place for the lawyers who hold the hands of both big pharma and small biotech is to try to balance that exciting new science that's looking for a new pathway with the fact that there are some very established pathways you need to know about and need to be able to satisfy the requirements that are laid down. That's a very interesting and important area and really distinguishes biotech entrepreneurship from a lot of other entrepreneurship in the world right now, where it's not one of the most, if you look at IT, it's not regulated, at least right now, like biotech. There's a lot of path breaking without the need to worry about where are the established rules and regulations. In biotech, we need to think about it, early and often.
That's really fair. I think that for small biotech companies that are just starting out, they have to realize that they need to look and they need good advice. And it's also not easy to hire people, especially in a small startup company, who have the experience they need. So we're fortunate that there are lawyers and others who can step in and fill the breach.
Well, and to that, Rob, you have many biotech and startup clients facing similar regulatory issues. How do you advise your clients to handle these types of challenges?
Well, I'd like to pick up on a couple of points that Don and Lisa made. There's a very different culture within a small entrepreneurial company, like a small biotech company and a well-established government agency. So it's really important to understand the cultural differences. One thing I tell a lot of clients is bring your enthusiasm to the table, but understand that a regulator is not looking for a sales pitch. It's an opportunity to educate a regulator because they handle hundreds and hundreds of innovations coming across their collective desks every day. They're going to need to learn about your expertise and what you bring to the table. The FDA has a very clear pathway. They are very open to discussions, but I'd also like to address the side that investors care about quite a bit, especially startup investors, is how is this going to come to market? And exactly who is going to buy the innovation. And from dozens and dozens of meetings, there are a few pearls that you can glean from all of these meetings. The first is that health plans and government plans are looking for good outcomes. If you can do something better, faster, perhaps cheaper, you're going to get their attention. But they're always looking for outcomes, and not just good outcomes across the board, outcomes that are targeted to their population. So for example, the Medicare population, they want to see good outcomes in people who are over 65. It's not that the agencies that you're dealing with have any particular hostility toward innovation. It's just that they understand that their role in the whole healthcare ecosystem, where are they going to fit? And regulatory agencies are very comfortable in the position of following a professional trend or following a professional consensus rather than being perceived as setting a standard or a new consensus because of the size of the agency. One thing that I think is very helpful and really beneficial for small biotech companies is that they're highly focused. They're highly focused on a particular patient population, a particular disease, and sitting down across from a regulator, if you ask for the moon and the stars, you're not likely to get it. But if you can say that we have a targeted intervention for a particular subset, and that subset is of interest to you, then you've surmounted a hurdle, and they can understand that what you're bringing to the table helps patients and is not an undue burden on the program. Contrast what's going on with a lot of small biotech companies, and I think we'll talk about it in a minute, is the drug that's currently under review by CMS for treating early stage Alzheimer's. A very broad population and a very expensive drug, and it's become highly controversial, one, because of the cost, and two, because of questions about the efficacy. If you have an intervention that is targeted at a much smaller population and is highly efficacious, then dealing with regulators is going to be a much, much easier ask. So always think of the ask and always think of the perspective of the regulator and how they would approach you.
Looking at the larger scope of the biotechnology business, I noted that neither you, Don, or you, Lisa, have backgrounds in medicine or STEM or finance. Did your background give you a special perspective on the process of developing new technologies and treatments?
That's really a great question, Rachel. And it leads us to who are the biotech entrepreneurs. If you look at the entrepreneurs in our industry, they come from a wide variety of backgrounds. And the reason is that running a biotech company is more than managing the science. We need to find a way to bring the resources together, which means raising money, hiring people, solving issues like what our regulatory challenges might be. For example, maintaining relationships with investors, with scientists, with people who run our studies. So a biotech entrepreneur has to bring a lot of different skills to the table. In that respect, I think that not being a scientist is fine. The other thing that's really interesting about our industry, though, is that the entrepreneurs are very highly educated, much more so than in any other industry. Many have doctorates, very high proportion went to the most selective colleges. A significant proportion also have more than one doctorate. And what they all have in common is that they have an ability to learn, which is terrific because something is changing all the time in our industry, whether it's the technology, we're learning about it, or things are changing in the regulatory or the financing environment. So basically, your background is important, but I think being able to learn and willing to thrive in a dynamic environment where there will always be challenges, where everything may not go correctly, may not go the way you expect, those are actually key to succeeding as an entrepreneur.
Lisa's exactly right about that. And one area you can see as being a challenge, no matter where you come from, whatever your background is communicating with investors. Investors come in all shapes and sizes and educational backgrounds, from generalists who have just liberal arts degrees all the way through people who have, a string of doctorates in the sciences. But they're rarely an expert in what your company does. And so your job, whether you went to school for biochemistry or whether you went to school for English or philosophy, is to be able to talk about what you're doing, why it's going to help the patients and deliver the outcomes that Rob has just talked about, and to be able to package that in a way that is at once scientifically sophisticated enough to please those with a scientific background and straightforwardly simple enough to be comprehensible by the generalist. That is a challenge for any CEO, and wherever you come from, if you can learn that, then you're going to be able to work well with investors to get the funding you need to give your products a chance.
That's great. Thank you. As Rob mentioned, the FDA has recently approved a biotech drug for treating Alzheimer's disease. And there's been a lot of controversy about this drug, both because of the cost, approximately $28,000 per year, but also based on the evidence of its effectiveness. CMS is currently considering whether to cover this drug under the Medicare program, and if so, under what conditions. What lessons do you think we can draw from this experience? Do you see this as a turning point for the industry, and might this lead to challenges for the development of new biotech drugs, particularly among investors or commercialization of innovations?
That's a really important question. I mean, one of the things we know is that new biotech drugs are often priced at what appear to be very high levels. But I think we need to start with the context. What we show in our book is that the vast majority of new products that are tried don't work. If you put 10 into studies starting in the laboratory, maybe one of them will make it. The cost of failure is extremely high. So one of the things to look at is how much money it takes to bring a successful product to the market. And that's going to affect the pricing, regardless of what the physical manufacturing cost is, all the development costs. Then on top of that, it's important to remember that not all products work for everyone. And then the question becomes, what's an acceptable efficacy rate? Is it worth it to have a product that works for 20% of the people? And the answer is, if there's no other treatment, then there's value to those 20%. Now, there's still the issue of the cost of the healthcare system, and it's important to think about ways to mitigate that, whether it's diagnostic tests that might help determine over time who is likely to benefit. But I think that we will never have inexpensive drugs created by our industry, because it's just not possible. I mean, even if you only worked on one product and it was successful from start to finish, it's still hundreds of millions of dollars. And the average cost is in the billions by the time you add in the failure rate. So I don't think anything has changed in the industry. I hope that there's a way to figure out who can benefit the most from this Alzheimer's drug, because we know we really need it.
I'm not sure I have anything thoughtful to add to that, other than it might be worth noting that many companies, and I don't know about this particular one, but I wouldn't be surprised if it falls into the same category, have patient access programs so that patients who don't have the resources to be able to pay for the drug or have the copay or have insurance, nevertheless have a chance to have access to it. That doesn't necessarily address the issue of how that affects Medicare or the broader healthcare system, but it does speak to some of the issues of health equity that are very much in the news today. I wish we could say that there's a turning point somewhere in development where you have a choice of product that works better compared to a product that works worse. But believe me, at every chance you have to make a choice, you pick what you think at the moment is going to be the most efficacious product. That is just a further evidence that what we don't know about drug development, what we don't know about human disease, still overwhelms what we do know. And it's the business of the biotech industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and the academic researchers that we all rely on to be able to shift that further in the right direction, so that we can bring down the cost of both the successes and the failures by being able to be more targeted. But that day has not arrived yet, I'm afraid.
I'll add one additional observation, and it's something that I tell a lot of innovators, if I'm able to speak to them very early on in the process, when I speak to entrepreneurs and also particularly to investors. This particular episode has highlighted something that all stakeholders should think about very early on in the process. To bring a product from bench to bedside, you have to jump through quite a number of regulatory hoops. And this episode really demonstrates that the outlook and the responsibilities of the FDA and the outlook and responsibilities of a large agency like CMS are quite different. There are certain points where there might be intersections, but they have different responsibilities. And really successful innovators and investors understand that they have to be able to chart their strategy for dealing with both agencies and their particular responsibilities early on in the process. Otherwise, they'll end up spending a lot of time and effort that will be wasted and will delay the ability to market any new innovation.
I think that's a very fair comment, and is one that, wearing my venture capital hat as well as my CEO hat, I think the industry has changed over time, and that investors and entrepreneurs are being more sensitive earlier in the equation. It's not just passion and scientific brilliance is going to win the day. And that's terrific, and a great place for folks like Rachel and Rob to be able to offer advice that will be meaningful in terms of how the company moves forward.
Thank you. That really leads to my last question that I'd like to ask each of you before we wrap up here. We've talked today about how research and development in biotech should still focus on multiple potential therapies, even with the understanding that many or most will not be successful. At what point in the pipeline do you think that biotech companies should start to think about the cost of potential therapies and how they might be received by regulators and payers? Do you think this needs to happen earlier in the process? And how can they strike an appropriate balance between being true innovators, but avoiding some of these controversies that we've talked about?
I think they need to start thinking about the regulatory pathway and the costs at the very outset of the company's operations. You have to believe there's a path through the regulatory hurdles and obstacles, or there's really not a good point in starting. Now, I don't think that helps very much when you think about winnowing down a pipeline, because we really do believe in the shots on goal approach, knowing that we simply can't predict what will work, but being very focused on a strategy that will help reach the regulatory goal of approval is really crucial to a company's success.
No question. And I think that is an area where the industry has become more thoughtful over time, and where investors have pressed the industry to become more thoughtful over time. These are not 6,000 science projects. They are 6,000 companies that have as a goal creating a commercially valuable new medicine that can be sold at a profit, that can return to the investors a good return on the monies they've invested in not only that product, but in the many, many others that ended up not making it, despite having just as good a story. I think that we're getting better at this, and having, savvy lawyers who can speak to an early stage company in a way that helps them convince their investors that there is a pathway, or that can speak to investors in a way that convinces them that there isn't, will help everybody's decision making. Although, speaking as an entrepreneur, I hope you can convince them that there is.
Rob, do you have further thoughts?
I certainly agree with everything that Don and Lisa said. My observation here would be that entrepreneurs certainly want to succeed, and investors certainly want to make a return on their investment. Really thoughtful investors will think about this early on, as will thoughtful innovators. Good investors will know, or should build into their business plan, that a certain number of investments are going to fail. But at the end of the day, they still want to succeed. They still want to make money. And so thinking about all of these issues and understanding whether the risks are risks that can be overcome, or risks that are simply impenetrable barriers, as early as possible, is very, very important, critical for the decision to invest and the decision to innovate.
Rob, Don, and Lisa, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us, Rachel.
Really appreciate it.
And thank you to all of our listeners. Don't forget to subscribe to the Diagnosing Healthcare podcast, which is available wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Rachel Weisblatt, and this has been Diagnosing Healthcare.
Thank you for listening to Diagnosing Healthcare. For show notes on today's episode, additional episodes, and more insights on trending issues in healthcare, please visit diagnosinghealthcare.com and be sure to subscribe on your preferred platform. The Employment Law This Week and Diagnosing Healthcare podcasts are presented by Epstein Becker Green, PC. All rights are reserved. This audio recording includes information about legal issues and legal developments. Such materials are for informational purposes only and may not reflect the most current legal developments. These informational materials are not intended and should not be taken as legal advice on any particular set of facts or circumstances, and these materials are not a substitute for the advice of competent counsel. The content reflects the personal views and opinions of the participants. No attorney-client relationship has been created by this audio recording. This audio recording may be considered attorney advertising in some jurisdictions under the applicable law and ethical rules. The determination of the need for legal services and the choice of a lawyer are extremely important decisions and should not be based solely upon advertisements or self-proclaimed expertise. No representation is made that the quality of the legal services to be performed is greater than the quality of legal services performed by other lawyers.